Hello and welcome to Roundtable. The man who led his country into a war that has lasted almost 11 years and cost upwards of 500,000 lives is making friends again. And some of those are at the heart of Europe. Syria's President Bashar al-Assad was a leader who must step aside, said the European Union in 2011, condemning what it called his brutal repression. What has changed since then? To have you along. I'm David Foster. Well, Assad is still there, despite the European Union giving maybe 25 billion euros to the people who were trying to overthrow him. Europe now realizes he's going nowhere, and the bloc is split on what to do next. Okay, let me introduce Dr. Andreas Krieg, Senior Lecturer at the School of Security Studies at King's College, London, the Royal College of Defence Studies. And via Skype from Doha, we have Ali Bakir, political analyst. And in Washington, D.C., we welcome Giorgio Cafiero, Chief Exec of Gulf State Analytics. Before we get chatting, I'm going to run through some of the slightly shifting sands of Arabia, if I may. What's happened with regard to Syria? Well, Jordan King Abdullah's telephoned President Assad. He's believed to want sanctions lifted. The Emirati foreign minister has been to Damascus, and along with Algeria, Oman, Bahrain and Jordan is said to want Syria back in the Arab League. Saudi Arabian and Syrian intelligence officials have met recently, we understand, although the Saudi foreign minister says we are not currently considering full re-engagement. Qatar's foreign minister saying normalizing relations with the Assad regime is not a step that we're thinking of or considering right now, and the same goes for Kuwait. So, Giorgio, let me come to you first of all. With all of those different approaches now, considering where we were in 2011 when the war started and the immediate clampdown on Assad, what are we seeing here? What's changing?
Well, as the Syrian regime has mostly won the civil war, at least from a military standpoint, numerous Arab governments over the past couple of years have sort of been shifting in the direction of renormalizing relations with Damascus. To put it simply, I think many Arab regimes, not all of them, but a growing number led by the UAE, have sort of come to the conclusion that re-engaging Assad is probably the best option, or maybe we can say the least worst option. And this is sort of about, I guess we could say, almost kind of coming to terms with reality and just sort of accepting the outcome of the conflict in Syria. But at the same time, there are definitely other factors in play too that give a number of Arab governments vested interests in renormalizing relations with Assad and trying to rehabilitate his image. Obviously, Assad crushed an Arab Spring uprising, and I think many, very cynically, I think many Arab governments are certainly happy that at the end of the day, was the outcome in Syria.
Okay, Ali, let me put this one to you. If Russia was the big winner by backing Assad, then Iran has been one of his best friends in this, and one of the reasons perhaps why we're seeing these Arab governments wanting to normalize relations with the president of Syria is because they don't want to see Iran gaining even more influence. Is that the way this is looking to you?
Not really, because I wouldn't say Assad won the war or is winning, but mostly there are ideological factors, interest factors, and also solidarity factors from the perspective of the Arab governments who are seeking normalization with Assad regime. At the end of the day, yes, Assad stopped the domino effect of the Arab uprising from reaching certain Arab countries. And also, usually military dictatorships and governments support each other regardless of the differences between them. We have like Egypt and Algeria, for example, supporting Assad regime for a long time. And we have the interest factor represented by Jordan in the current situation. But going back to the main driver behind the normalization efforts with Assad regime in the Arab world, the UAE, The UAE has been promoting the claim that engaging with Assad and rehabilitating him and his regime and supporting him will ultimately decrease Iran's influence over Syria
Well,
and in the
which
region.
is sort of where I was driving when I asked you the question. So if I'm going to turn this now towards Europe, which I will do in a little bit because that's the basis of this program. So we see the Gulf countries trying to normalize relations, perhaps because they want to see Iranian influence go down. What is the reason why a number of European countries are perhaps breaking rank, if you like, with the party, with the bloc line? Andreas.
Yeah, very good point. I think it goes back to what Ali was saying. I mean, there is an interest-based part of that engagement, and there is an ideological one. And I think what we see from a European point of view is that those Europeans who fall in line with re-engaging or the idea of a normalization of the Assad regime are those who are ideologically closer to the counter-revolutionaries in the region. Those are the people who are very close to the UAE, who see political Islam as quite a problem. They see migration as quite a problem. And they see Syria as been somewhat this kind of regional world war, if you will, that has brought some of the most violent non-state actors to the forefront, including obviously ISIS. And those kind of European countries are not only in fear of migrants coming because of a destabilizing Syria, but they're saying, let's bring back the Assad regime that will keep a kind of a lid on migration.
So it's
but
either
also
Assad
on
or ISIS. I mean, it's not as black and white as that, but
no, it is presented.
That's their thinking.
Exactly. The narrative is, what do you want? Do you want the Assad regime or you want ISIS? And pretty much anything is being framed here as ISIS, which is too Islamic for them or is a non-state actor.
So can we identify the nature of these European countries that are now lukewarm to pressure on Assad? They're not backing him necessarily, but can we identify them either by name or by the type of regimes that they have in place?
I mean, if you look at Hungary, for example, right? Hungary is one of these illiberal democracies that are increasingly becoming more and more illiberal in the eastern part of Europe. They have a fear of political Islam. They have a fear of the Islamization of the Occident, hence why they've always kind of pushed against migration. We've seen that particularly in the narrative in Hungary. A lot of those people who are against migration are on the far right in Europe, who are also pushing for a re-engagement with the Assad regime. We've seen that the AfD, for example, the right-wing populist party in Germany, has also been outreaching to the Assad regime. We have countries like Greece, for example, have a problem with Turkey as well, who are willing to re-engage bit by bit with the Assad regime.
Okay. I'm going to come to you, Giorgio, if I may. Before I do that, I want to play this from the tourism minister of Syria. There were many political players we could have put up there, but this is from the man in charge of encouraging visitors to come to Syria.
All European nationalities request to come to Syria. I'm not saying the number of these requests are as it was before the war, but we hope it will increase despite the sanctions and despite the siege. European cultural tourism and Western countries will return to Syria, but we are counting on tourism from friendly countries first.
So my question to you, Giorgio, after that is not so much how much has Syria recovered, if it has at all, to welcome visitors, but are these companies and these people getting in before others do? In other words, they see opportunities here that may not present themselves unless they're first at the gate.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. It seems that many people who are looking at Syria think that there's going to be some sort of inevitable return of Syria to a status that it was before 2011, being a quote-unquote normal country. Probably many people around the region and around the world think that the U.S.'s Caesar Act is not going to be imposed on Syria forever.
So we should explain that the Caesar Act is the act that came out of the United States that basically prevented anybody anywhere doing any business with Assad.
That's right. Yeah, these are Trump-era sanctions that the Biden administration has kept in place. And that has done so much to limit the extent to which countries around the world are able or willing to make investments in Syria or trade with Syria. But I think many people think that at some point down the line, not tomorrow, but some point in the future, Caesar Act won't be there. There will be economic opportunities in Syria. And yeah, I think you're right to point out that some of these people who are maybe trying to go in right now think that there are some advantages to getting in before many other people do, some advantages that come with sort of taking some risks early on from their perspective.
And are there countries, Ali, if I can come to you, and of course you can all say something anytime you want, don't wait for me to ask a question, are there countries putting gentle pressure, if you like, on the Biden regime to relax those elements of the Caesar Act that are so restrictive for other countries besides Syria? Are they trying to sort of change the US's position?
I don't think the Biden administration needs anyone to pressure it to, lessen the pressure on Assad regime, because from the beginning, the U.S. administration was using Syria as a card to appease countries like Iran and Russia and try to reach a kind of a deal with them. And this happened during the Obama administration. We all know that how the Obama's red line turned into green light, actually, to Assad regime to massacre the people. And basically, he used Syria to reach the JCPOA with Iran. And now Biden is doing the same thing. He already has the Caesar Act, but he's not obviously applying it. We have an example. The UAE is interacting and actually on so many levels, politically, economically, and even militarily with Assad regime without facing any sanctions. Also Jordan lately and Egypt. So I don't think that these Arab countries are taking initiatives by themselves without the contest or a green light from the US administration.
Andreas, I mean, say whatever you want if you like, but my question is, does this mean Assad is home and free if the United States is in effect turning a blind eye, and that the European Union will eventually do the same thing?
Well, it goes to what I wanted to say is that the core element of why certain countries are now, even the West, falling into the normalization camp is because there's a lack of overall strategy. There has been a lack of overall strategy in Washington over a long period of time, going back to the Obama years, where we never really knew what America's objectives were. The objectives that have been recently stated by the US government have been very much tactical or operational. They're never strategic, they're never political. The same goes for Europe. Europe has said what they don't want, but they also never say what they do want. And they never have come up with any means and ways to actually implement it. And that kind of leaves a vacuum. And that vacuum is now being generated or being played with as opportunity by some countries like the UAE, and that kind of provides opportunities for the Assad regime.
Well, I'm going to play Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, in just a moment, but if either you, Giorgio, or you, Ali, want to come in at this particular point, I'll wait just a few minutes. Ali, please carry on.
Europeans usually follow the line of the US, and when they see the US is not willing to put pressure on Assad regime or even try to push him to commit to the outcomes of Geneva communique or the UN resolutions, then they don't have also incentives to do this otherwise. They are just following the US line, and everyone is trying to secure its own interest. At the end of the day, some European countries prefer Assad regime to stay rather than to see a change in Syria. But ultimately, they are not dealing with the roots of the problem, and this is the main problem to us in the region. Assad is the why we do have catastrophes in the region, including migrations and terrorism and radicalism, and etc. And unless they are willing to face this reality, then we will stay in the same vicious circle. Supporting Assad or rehabilitating him will not solve his own problems or the migration problems, in my opinion.
Okay, I'm going to play Antony Blinken now.
On Syria. I tell you, we're concerned about the signals that some of these visits and engagements are sending. And I would simply urge all of our partners to remember the crimes that the Assad regime has committed and indeed continues to commit. We don't support normalization.
So, Giorgio, that's what he's saying, and yet we're hearing from you guys around the table that, in fact, the US is turning a slightly blind eye to what's going on. Would those stalwarts of punishing Assad in Europe, such as Germany, France, Italy, be likely to do a similar thing, to say, we don't like the guy, we say he's got to leave, but at the same time understanding that there's a realpolitik in this and he's unlikely to be going anywhere?
Yeah, I think there's an important divide in Europe that we should point out. There, as Andreas mentioned, you have a government in Hungary which is very, very sympathetic to Assad and everything he's done over the past 10 years. If you listen to Hungarian officials speak, they portray Assad as a defender of Christians, They think that he's been triumphant in fighting terrorism. Now, that kind of narrative is totally rejected by European countries in Western Europe. I think there's going to come a point eventually where probably all or most of the EU members renormalize relations with Syria, but there's not going to be ceremonies or flowery rhetoric when that happens. There's not going to be photo ops of the Syrian embassies reopening in Western European capitals. It will be sort of, if it happens, I think it will be because they concluded that it was necessary to do so, not because there's any sympathy or love for Assad or the people around him.
In fact, they're doing something of the sort at the moment, aren't they? They're putting in, instead of ambassadors, they're putting in chargé d'affaires, which in many ways is exactly the same. It's looking after a country's interests in another nation, but doesn't send the big signal.
Yes. I think it's a gradual, I agree with it, Giorgio here. This is a gradual normalization. We shouldn't expect anything to happen in the short or mid-term. I think this is more of a long-term development. But it will happen gradually, where sanctions will be lifted gradually, where normalization happens gradually. Also, on the ground, we've seen the regime recapturing territory gradually. It's not something that, the normalization within Syria is something that the Assad regime has done also gradually. So Assad has always played the long-term card. And there's one thing that Western countries can't do is long-term thinking, long-term strategy. And Europeans, including as much as the Americans as well. And I think this kind of gradual phasing out of sanctions, the gradual restoration of some sort of relationship with the Assad regime is something that we're most likely going to see. And, doing that for a variety of different reasons.
24 billion euros, give or take a few hundred million here or there, is what the European Union has pushed into humanitarian efforts, looking after refugees, supporting the opposition. In other words, money to topple Assad to some extent. And now it's sort of saying, well, actually, you're probably going to stay there. We'll have to deal with you. That's the reality of life. Has the European Union, have the United States, to some extent, been humiliated in this by Russia?
Absolutely, not just by the Russians, but including by the regime. The regime has actually played all its cards, and it's still there, despite the alleged only superpower in the world, with support by its very important P5 nations, Western Europe, supporting the toppling of the regime. And I think the signal that it sends actually to other authoritarians in the region is that in the end of the day, the liberal world order, while it still has some teeth, is not able to actually change what happens on the ground, and that's a major defeat for that.
And isn't that, either you, Ali, or I'll come to you first of all, Giorgio, isn't that exactly what many of the authoritarian rulers in the Middle East wanted to see, that no matter what you try and do, the people at the top are going to stay in power?
For many years and decades, the Syrian government had relationships with Iran, with Lebanese Hezbollah, that made many Arab regimes very uncomfortable with the way Assad was running Syria. But again, at the end of the day, though, he is one of their fellow Arab authoritarian rulers. And I think most of the governments in the region, I'm not talking about societies here, but I'm just talking about governments in the region, were nervous about what a post-Assad Syria could look like and what would be the precedent set if there was a successful Arab Spring revolution in Syria. I think Assad's survival has come as a relief to a number of Arab governments.
We've got Poland and Hungary that have been quoted. There's also Serbia, Greek Cyprus, Austria, other countries in Europe that are leaning towards Assad to some extent. How will they be able to leverage this, apart from migration, to their benefit if they get close to Assad? When we're seeing Russia, this is for you, Ali, it's for everybody, in fact, when they see Russia already well in there, China making inroads, they're two massive economic and military powers. How are these small nations going to make any capital out of this?
I'm not sure they are going to do any capital. I mean, the only thing that they are doing is presenting service for the Assad regime on behalf, probably, of other countries. And you have mentioned now some countries, but we have countries like France that would be probably okay with Assad staying in power. France has been also supporting dictators in the Arab world, in Egypt, in Libya, and elsewhere. So I don't believe that Europeans didn't have the leverage to pressure Assad. It's that, and I agree with Andreas here. He played on the time card very well, and he, as a regime, knows what he wants. But the Europeans, they were, against each other. No unified really position and no real action, just words. And at the end of the day, they followed the U.S. line, and the U.S. was not willing to topple Assad. They used Syria as a card. So I don't see an end game here. Okay, they are trying to give Assad a lifeline right now, indirectly, but I see the problems staying there in a way or another.
You nodded when Ali there mentioned France. I'll ask you about Germany, Italy, and the other bigger countries in just a moment. But France's position must have shifted dramatically.
Yes and no. I mean, under Macron, and I completely agree with Ali, under Macron, we've seen France becoming a lot more a populist country, a country that is trying to clamp down on particular political Islam. If you look at the elections going on at the moment, political Islam is vilified, securitized, and fighting Islamism equals fighting terrorism for Macron. We've seen that happening in Libya. We've seen that happening supporting the UAE in Yemen as well. And Assad also fits into that kind of narrative because Assad has from the beginning said, I'm fighting terrorism. Although he was clamping down on revolutionaries, it was fighting terrorism. And that narrative has been adopted and propagated by the UAE and has now been adopted by the Macron government as well. And I think that is highly problematic. But it also says that, realpolitik is a lot more important. It's about geostrategic interest. We don't really care that much from a Western point of view about liberal values.
Forget principles.
Correct. And that is exactly the crisis that the liberal world order is in, because we don't stick up for the principles that we once advanced.
Okay, Giorgio, Germany, Italy, other progressive liberal countries, if you like, within Europe, are they going to push those principles to one side and eventually come to realize that they have to live with Assad and they have to get on with it?
I think eventually that will happen, but probably those EU members that you just mentioned, I think they'll probably be some of the last members of the EU to make that move.
And eventually when they do it, it'll be because they wanted to save face in the first hand. Do you think that means that they will have missed out on opportunities?
I think that's fair to say. From a very Machiavellian country, a Machiavellian standpoint, the countries that are trying to re-engage Syria early on will probably benefit in certain ways from doing so. When you talk about economic opportunities, but I think the view in countries like Italy and Germany is that Assad's crimes simply put him beyond the pale, and there's not really an appetite for doing anything to legitimize or partially legitimize his government. But again, this brings us back to this other question. What are the other options? If Assad is going to stay, and if you want to have some sort of a relationship with Syria, that's going to require having some sort of a relationship with the government. It's very humiliating. There's definitely a lot of pride swallowing that has to take place. But because I don't think there are really any other options, I do believe that pretty much most of Europe will move in that direction. But again, countries like Italy and Germany probably moving in that direction at a much slower rate. At least that's my opinion.
Let's look at it from inside Syria, if we may, Ali, and say what is in this for Assad other than remaining in power? And what leverage does he have? Because we've recently done on this program Sudan and the threats from one of the military rulers there to open the borders and let migrants flood into Europe. We've done the same with Belarus and Poland and the border there. Could Assad use that as leverage to get what he wanted out of the European capitals?
Yes, sure. And he has been trying for a time, attacking Idlib, for example, where more than 3.5 million people residing is catastrophic. And we know that Turkey stopped his plans when he was supported by Iran and Russia a couple of years ago. And he can still, and I mean, he wants to try right now to again, but I'm not sure whether Turkey will allow him to do this at this point. He's also making use of the rapprochement efforts and the normalization efforts from the Arab world and also from the Europeans to try to leverage this against those who are still refuse Assad to stay in power, whether internal opposition or external countries like Turkey. He's making use of these connections to leverage them against these countries. And also he's making use of the his supporters, the Iranians and Russians, trying sometimes to balance between them and
Ali, thank
using
you.
one of them against the other.
I'm going to have to cut you off mid-flow there because we're coming towards the very end. And Andreas, I just wanted to ask you this. We talked about Russia being a winner, Assad being a winner. Who are the losers in this?
Well, I think those who have really backed the opposition early on, at least for the moment, come out to be the losers. That is Turkey, that is Qatar, Saudi Arabia, who've also been on the opposite side of fighting Assad. But, you know, I'm looking at this with a little bit more caveat because I don't think that Assad necessarily has one. He's not as stable as he used to be. The regime is still in a lot of areas on the balance, and you know we could easily see an Arab Spring 2.0.
It's gone beyond half-time. We're in time added on, are we?
Yes, but there might be another 90 minutes to play. You don't know that.
Let's hope not. Thank you very much indeed. 90 minutes lasting 11 plus years. Thank you very much indeed from Doha. Thank you from Washington, D.C. Andreas, very good to see you back in the studio. And thank you wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Round Table. We'll be back pretty soon. For now, from me, David Foster and the Round Table team, goodbye.